November 22nd, 1945. The atmosphere in the Rhineland held the distinct aroma of sodden soil and coal soot, a rather acrid fragrance clinging to the remnants of a fractured nation. Amidst the rubble of toppled edifices and partially concealed subterranean chambers, a gathering of German women remained in quiet contemplation. Their forms were cloaked in mended overcoats, their gazes vacant, etched with the hollowness of profound hunger. They had been placed under the charge of American soldiers, formerly classified as captives. However, unlike the protracted shackled progressions that had conveyed men across the European continent, this state of confinement was characterized by an understated, more nebulous quality. They were neither recognized as unmolested civilians nor as combatants, but rather as adrift remnants of a vanquished Reich, awaiting clarification on their captors' intentions. On this particular date, however, an unforeseen event transpired. American officers had decreed a celebratory feast, a cherished observance transported across the Atlantic, even amidst wartime. For numerous weeks, vessels had offloaded shipments of chilled fowl, ample sacks of tubers, substantial crates of milled grain, and sealed containers of tart berries. The banquet was initially designated for military personnel far from their domiciles, young individuals yearning for the familiar repasts at their mothers' tables in states such as Iowa, Georgia, or Michigan. Nevertheless, the presiding officers rendered a determination that surprised even their own subordinates. They extended the invitation to the women confined behind the wire entanglement, those designated as adversaries, individuals indoctrinated through years of potent rhetoric, warning of American barbarity. The women entered the communal dining hall with hesitant footsteps, their footwear creating a scuffing sound upon the wooden flooring, their stomachs constricted at the rich effluences wafting through the air, roasted meats, a thickened gravy abundant with fat, and bread freshly baked in field ovens. They exchanged fleeting glances, their hushed utterances darting between them in hesitant German. Could this be genuine, or was it a stratagem? A deliberate display intended to humiliate their weakened state. Some women tightly clenched their fists, their fingernails soiled with earth, bracing for disappointment. The hall itself was not opulent. Planks had been hastily assembled to form elongated tables, their surfaces laden with stacked tin platters, while stubs of candles, planted within bottles, battled the encroaching early twilight. Yet, for these women, whose sustenance had consisted of watery broth and bread augmented with sawdust, the sheer spectacle of such abundance was overwhelming. The resonant clang of cookware could be heard from a distance. Soldiers' laughter echoed in English, and at the epicenter of it all stood rows of steaming poultry, their skins glistening golden from melted butter. The contrast was profoundly surreal, victors carving sustenance for the vanquished. One woman, appearing to be in her early 30s, her hair secured beneath a tattered headscarf, sat rigidly as a soldier, placed a portion of turkey onto her plate. She offered no word of thanks. She was unable to. Her mind replayed years of admonitions. Americans were savages. Americans would deliberately starve them. Americans would revel in their suffering. Her gaze remained fixed upon the meat, as if it possessed the potential to vanish. Another, considerably younger, perhaps no more than 20 years of age, closed her eyes and drew in the warm vapor rising from the prepared tubers. Her lips quivered. The aroma evoked a sense of remembrance. Despite her never having partaken in such fare, it conjured recollections of narratives shared prior to the conflict, of familial gatherings that seemed to belong to an entirely different existence. The soldiers circulated amongst them, distributing rolls and ladling gravy. An undercurrent of unease permeated the atmosphere, not solely emanating from the women, but also from the men serving them. Some servicemen expressed discomfort, grumbling that providing sustenance to Germans felt akin to rewarding the enemy. Others simply shrugged, muttering that it was Thanksgiving, and what harm could truly come from satisfying an empty stomach. For a considerable number, the cessation of hostilities had occurred in May, yet ingrained habits of suspicion persisted. Behind every gesture of leniency lay the poignant remembrance of comrades lost on distant shores and within dense forests. Nevertheless, here, within this hall redolent with herbs and onions, a fragile interlude unfolded. Forks hovered above the plates. Conversation ceased. The inaugural taste had yet to be experienced. Hunger gnawed at the women, but distrust held them captive. One finally raised her fork, a figure exuding maternal warmth, her hair streaked with gray, her cheeks hollowed, yet her bearing remained proud. She brought a small portion of the fowl to her lips. For a fleeting moment, her countenance remained inscrutable. Then, almost involuntarily, moisture welled in her eyes. The meat was exquisitely tender, expertly seasoned, and bathed in juices that resonated with her body's memory of genuine nourishment. She chewed slowly, as if hesitant to swallow, fearing it might shatter the enchantment. Her quiet acquiescence initiated a cascade. Others followed suit, the gentle clinking of forks, the taking of bites, the initial sounds of mastication filling the preceding silence. Some women inclined their heads as if in prayer. Tears traced paths down their weathered countenances, pooling within the furrows of exhaustion. To savor butter after years of consuming ersatz margarine, to experience warmth radiating from within, it transcended mere sustenance. It represented an unveiling, a profound realization that the doctrines they had absorbed were fundamentally flawed. Their perceived adversaries were not poisoning them. Rather, they were providing them with food. A soldier stationed nearby observed the tears. He shifted uncomfortably, murmuring under his breath, "It's just turkey." Yet, a part of him understood it was far more than mere poultry. It was an implement more potent than weaponry, kindness. Another soldier offered a dry jest regarding the fowl being overcooked. To his astonishment, a ripple of mirth spread amongst the women. Laughter, after years of enforced silence. Even the sound itself startled them. Beyond the confines of the hall, the town remained a landscape of devastation. Families scoured the ruins for fuel to ignite their fires. Children diligently searched for meager scraps. The approaching winter promised to be exceptionally harsh. However, here, within this hall illuminated by dwindling candles, an abundance prevailed, an oasis of plenty amidst an expanse of scarcity. The contrast was nearly unbearable. A young woman clutched her plate with both hands, not out of apprehension of it being seized, but because it anchored her to a moment that felt akin to salvation. Her tears flowed freely, mingling with the rich gravy. The internal conflict, however, did not dissipate. Beneath the tears lay a profound sense of shame. To be nourished by those they had been conditioned to perceive as malevolent entities was a profound humiliation, a stripping away of their final bastions of dignity. Some women pushed their plates away before completing their meals, overwhelmed by the stark juxtaposition of their gnawing hunger and their deeply ingrained sense of self-respect. One woman whispered to another, "If my husband could witness this moment." Her words trailing off, subsumed by an immense grief. Nevertheless, the meal continued. The candles flickered lower, the plates gradually emptied, and when the women finally set down their cutlery, a stillness descended, more profound than any that had preceded it. For the first time in an extended period, their stomachs were replete. For the first time in recent memory, their captors appeared less like apparitions conjured by propaganda and more like ordinary men. Yet this very acknowledgement introduced its own peculiar form of dread. If their adversaries possessed the capacity for compassion, then every other aspect of their lived experience, the animosity, the relentless combat, the tragic losses, assumed a more agonizing significance. To what end had it all transpired? The officers observing from a distance remained largely silent. They had anticipated expressions of gratitude, perhaps a sense of relief, but the outpouring of tears had been unexpected. And as the women wiped their eyes with the frayed edges of their sleeves, one soldier leaned towards another and softly remarked, "We simply offered them a thanksgiving." But what will transpire when they begin to accept it as truth? That question hung in the candlelit air, weightier than any smoke, more oppressive than the ensuing silence. For this was demonstrably more than a mere meal. It represented the initial fracture in a carefully constructed edifice of falsehoods, a minute fissure portending a much wider rupture. And as night enveloped the Rhineland, the women carried that distinct taste with them, a complex blend of sweetness, saltiness, tenderness, and an indelible essence into an unforeseen future. The silence that followed the repast did not endure indefinitely. While hunger had been appeased, the intellect, meticulously schooled in suspicion over years, began to stir with a multitude of inquiries. Around the tables, the women regarded one another with palpable unease. They had ingested not only the turkey and potatoes, but also the dismantling of a world painstakingly constructed through relentless propaganda. It had been simpler, perhaps, to harbor animosity towards an adversary incapable of warmth, an enemy who never exhibited clemency. However, what was the implication when the very fiend one had been warned against served them supper? The conflict had already ravaged their residences and sundered their families. Now it commenced the disintegration of their firmly held convictions. For a considerable duration, German women had been incessantly told that Americans were barbarous brutes. Propaganda posters depicted exaggerated caricatures of imposing, broad-shouldered men with insatiable grins, their implements dripping with crimson. Periodicals characterized them as a mongrelized populace, devoid of honor. Joseph Goebbels's impassioned orations relentlessly reinforced this narrative. To fall under American dominion was to invite degradation, profound humiliation, and potentially far worse. These pronouncements had not been abstract notions. They had been instilled in classrooms, whispered in the confines of bomb shelters, and transmitted like somber scripture. One woman at the table distinctly recalled her instructor's emphatic assertion that American soldiers would carve Nazi insignia onto the foreheads of German children. She remembered trembling at the very prospect, never questioning the veracity of such a claim. And yet, when the doors of the mess hall swung open, she observed no raised blades, no malevolent expressions. Instead, she saw soldiers, young, weary, some scarcely older than her own brother, bearing platters laden with provisions. Her stomach readily accepted what her mind struggled to comprehend, the enemy's unexpected generosity. Each morsel consumed effectively eroded a lifetime of ingrained conditioning. It was as though the turkey itself engaged in a debate with Goebbels, and the argument proved devastatingly compelling. The American servicemen were not oblivious to the profound irony. Many had traversed France, Belgium, and ultimately entered Germany, interring fallen comrades along the arduous journey. Some still bore the remnants of shrapnel wounds beneath their uniforms, tangible reminders etched into their very flesh. To them, the act of providing sustenance to German prisoners struck them as illogical, even deeply insulting. A private hailing from Ohio confided to his sleeping companion afterward, "My buddy perished in the Hurtgen, and now we're serving turkey to the very individuals who cheered his demise." His words conveyed the acrid sting of personal loss. Nevertheless, even he had noted the tears, the subtle softening of the women's faces, as if rediscovering their intrinsic humanity. He was at a loss to interpret this phenomenon. None of them were. Despite this, the decision to extend the Thanksgiving feast had not originated solely from benevolent sentiment. It was, in fact, a deliberate policy, subtle yet strategically implemented. By the latter part of 1945, the United States aimed to differentiate itself from the Soviet Union, whose treatment of prisoners was widely recognized as exceptionally severe. American officers understood that acts of clemency could serve as a potent weapon, and that feeding the defeated populace could foster alliances where military might had failed. Food, in essence, represented a significant form of power on a continent gripped by widespread famine. Consequently, what appeared as simple magnanimity was, in reality, a calculated strategy, though its impact reverberated far beyond the calculations of its originators. One woman, exceedingly thin, clutched her fork with trembling fingers. She had lost her husband on the Eastern Front, engulfed by the maw of Stalingrad, and her sole son tragically perished in an aerial assault on Hamburg. To her, life had become an existence defined by pervasive absence. She had fully anticipated her captors would treat her as a sworn enemy, stripping her of her dignity as a punitive measure for the ideology she had once espoused. Instead, she found herself being offered bread so warm it threatened to burn her fingertips. She wept not merely for the exquisite taste, but for the dawning realization that the world was considerably larger and infinitely more complex than she had been led to believe. She wept because kindness proved a far more challenging burden to bear than cruelty. Across from her, another woman confided to her neighbor, "What if they are merely feigning? What if tomorrow they turn on us?" Fear remained a tenacious companion, unwilling to relinquish its hold. Her eyes darted toward the soldiers, observing their effortless laughter, their casual jests regarding the turkey's dryness. She found it impossible to reconcile those images with the dire warnings deeply imprinted in her mind. However, once doubt took root, it proved ineradicable. Even within her suspicion, she had experienced something unforgettable. The Americans, too, underwent subtle transformations. A corporal from Kansas City, who had once stormed a farmhouse only to discover terrified civilians within, later recounted, "I believed I detested them. But when you witness tears shed over a piece of turkey, you comprehend that animosity is an exceedingly burdensome emotion to carry." His words did not erase the horrors of the war, nor did they serve as an absolution. However, they revealed a fissure in the monolithic wall separating the conquerors from the conquered. For a fleeting moment, both factions glimpsed something beyond the roles rigidly prescribed by propaganda and the demarcations of battle lines. In the aftermath of the dinner, hushed conversations circulated throughout the camp. Women spoke discreetly of the meal, as if articulating it aloud might shatter its delicate enchantment. Some described the flavors with a profound reverence: the perfectly crisp skin of the fowl, the velvety mashed potatoes that dissolved upon the tongue, the bread so remarkably soft it seemed implausible after years of encountering hardened fare. Others spoke of their tears, feeling a sense of embarrassment, yet unable to deny their occurrence. They refrained from labeling it as kindness. They dared not. But they recognized it as something distinctly different from the expectations instilled in them. Within those murmured recollections, a novel perspective began to germinate. History is frequently chronicled through the lens of battles and treaties. However, in this instance, the battlefield resided within the human heart. The machinery of propaganda had armed these women with a fear more acute than any bayonet, yet a single meal had penetrated its defenses. The inherent contradiction was far too striking to disregard. On one hand, their cities lay in ruins, their families irrevocably scattered. On the other hand, the very adversary responsible for their devastation was now providing them with sustenance. This was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was undeniably profound confusion. And confusion frequently serves as the initial stride towards transformation. One cannot overlook the statistical realities. In the latter part of 1945, the average German civilian consumed a mere 1/20th of a calorie per day, and often considerably less in regions heavily subjected to aerial bombardment. Malnutrition spread with alarming rapidity. Reports chronicle instances of children fainting in schoolrooms and women collapsing while scavenging through the wreckage. Against this grim backdrop, the Thanksgiving meal was not merely an act of generosity. It was, in a profound sense, miraculous. For a significant number of these women, it marked the first occasion in years that they had eaten until they were completely satisfied. That tangible physical sensation carried an emotional weight that words could scarcely articulate. Profound hunger has the capacity to erode the most deeply entrenched certainties, and satiety plants the seeds of doubt within the fertile ground of animosity. The soldiers' intention was not to provoke tears. They simply desired to observe their own holiday, a poignant reminder of home. Yet, the unintended consequence proved remarkably potent. The women perceived humanity where they had been conditioned to expect savagery, and in witnessing it, they were compelled to confront their own ingrained blindness. Some resented this revelation, while others readily embraced it, but none possessed the capacity to erase it. The lingering taste persisted long after the plates had been cleared, an intangible memento that truth can, on occasion, manifest in the guise of rich gravy and humble bread rolls. Nevertheless, a complete reconciliation remained far from assured. The tears shed over the turkey did not obliterate the graves dug in France, nor did they erase the searing memories of bombs raining down upon Dresden. The internal conflict persisted. How does one navigate a world where adversaries can exhibit genuine humanity? The women carried this internal struggle in profound silence, torn between a sense of relief and an undercurrent of guilt, caught between burgeoning gratitude and persistent grief. As the mess hall emptied that evening, a soldier leaned against the doorframe, observing them as they shuffled back to their quarters. He had fought through the Ardennes, having witnessed an excessive amount of death to entertain any belief in miracles. Yet, he later admitted it was a most peculiar experience. We fed them, and it felt like the war fractured a little, right there at the table. He shook his head, a look of enduring puzzlement etched on his face years later. And though the candles had dwindled to mere stubs and the echoes of laughter had long since faded, The question remained, growing heavier with each passing day. If propaganda could crumble over a single meal, what other deeply held beliefs might soon follow suit? Snow began to fall in delicate flakes upon the ruined town, gently softening the jagged walls that still bore the indelible scars of fire. Within the confines of the camp, the women returned to their barracks following the Thanksgiving observance, carrying the distinct flavor of turkey as if it were a hidden ember nestled within their chests. It did not, however, warm every aspect of their existence. Grief still lingered like residual smoke, yet it now flickered, resisting the urge to be completely extinguished. In the subsequent days, conversations began to flourish in areas where silence had previously dominated. Whispers gradually evolved into spoken sentences, and these sentences transformed into quiet exchanges exchanged across the tables. Something fundamental had shifted, as though the very barbed wire encircling them had loosened its grip, not through any physical alteration, but through a change in their collective mindset. The dismantling of these barriers did not occur with any grand fanfare. Instead, it manifested in gestures so subtle they might easily have been overlooked. A soldier presented a woman with a cigarette, and rather than recoiling, she accepted it, inhaling with hands that trembled slightly. Another soldier carelessly dropped a chocolate bar onto a bunk, pretending it was an accidental occurrence, and the women, who had not tasted sweetness for years, carefully broke it into portions and shared it as if it were a sacred communion. Each such act incrementally chipped away at the formidable wall of suspicion, allowing faint rays of light to penetrate the growing fissures. Beyond the camp's perimeter, the world outside continued to grapple with extreme hunger. Reports emerging from the harsh winter of 1945 to 1946 documented a precipitous decline in caloric intake, falling below essential subsistence levels in numerous German towns. Children could be observed scavenging for discarded potato peels from refuse heaps. Women resorted to stripping bark from trees in a desperate attempt to stretch their meager flour rations. Against this stark and bleak tableau, the provisions shared by the American soldiers transcended mere sustenance. They represented the very essence of survival. Statistical data, cold and impersonal on paper, translated into tangible warmth felt upon the skin and a return of color to hollowed cheeks. Each individual experiencing a sensation of fullness stood in stark and poignant contrast to their neighbors just beyond the camp fences, gaunt and with eyes that bore the emptiness of profound deprivation. The women were acutely aware of this disparity, and a sense of guilt pressed against their burgeoning gratitude, much like two crossed knives. For one young prisoner, scarcely 23 years of age, the shattering of ingrained propaganda proved almost unbearable. She had spent her formative teenage years enthusiastically applauding political speeches, diligently repeating official slogans, and clinging resolutely to a sense of certainty, even as bombs rained down from the heavens. Now, she sat at a crudely assembled table, slowly chewing a Hershey bar, a confection bestowed upon her by a man whose name she would likely never know. The tears that surprised her were not solely born of relief, but also of a profound shame for having so readily believed falsehoods, for having so completely swallowed them whole. She confessed in a hushed whisper to her bunkmate, "If they are human, then what have we truly been?" The question reverberated like a bell, one that no one seemed eager to answer. The soldiers, too, experienced a palpable sense of change. They had received strict instructions not to engage in fraternization, and had been warned that any inclination toward sympathy might compromise their disciplinary resolve. However, that very discipline began to erode in the face of pervasive hunger and undeniable humanity. One GI from Nebraska found himself recalling his own sisters when he looked upon the women. Their hair was disheveled, their dresses patched and worn, yet he could not bring himself to perceive them as monstrous beings. He later articulated his sentiment, stating, "They resembled my own family would have, had the war instead descended upon my farm rather than theirs." That particular thought lingered, gnawing at him more persistently than any military regulation ever could. Within the mess hall, the established barriers continued to crumble with increasing speed. The women began to partake in their meals with noticeably less hesitation, although a residual sense of pride continued to stiffen their upright posture. Soldiers started to take seats in their proximity, engaging in tentative conversations about their homes, employing halting German or resorting to gestures when verbal communication proved insufficient. A spontaneous laugh erupting over a spilled cup of coffee began to sound almost commonplace. The sheer strangeness lay not in the act itself, but in the very possibility of it occurring, enemies sharing sustenance without resorting to mutual destruction. It startled both parties, as though humanity itself had stealthily infiltrated the premises as contraband. History texts often prioritize policies and official treaties, but here, the policy of mercy was unfolding vividly through the expressions on human faces. President Truman's administration had already initiated the dispatch of substantial shipments of wheat and cornmeal into Germany, recognizing that widespread starvation amongst millions would inevitably foster rebellion rather than cultivate peace. The comprehensive Marshall Plan remained still 2 years away from implementation. Nevertheless, the foundational principles of its underlying philosophy were already beginning to sprout and take root in these small, incremental exchanges. Food served as a strategic tool, but it was also a powerful medium of revelation. One could not consume propaganda. One could not chew upon lies. The women came to understand this fundamental truth, one bite at a time. One evening, a woman, approximately 35 years of age, who had once been a staunch member of the ruling party, broke into uncontrollable sobs over a simple crust of bread, so remarkably soft it was unlike anything she could recall. Between ragged breaths and tears, she murmured, "All those years they told us." She did not complete the sentence. It was entirely unnecessary. Around her, other women nodded in solemn agreement, their silence thick with a shared understanding. The collapse of established barriers was not a thunderous event, but rather a quiet, gradual process, akin to frost melting under the weak rays of the early spring sun. And yet, its irreversibility was no less profound. Even a semblance of humor began to emerge, tentative at first, but undeniably real. A soldier humorously critiqued his own culinary skills, claiming the turkey had met its demise twice, once in the field and again in the oven. The women responded with laughter, not because the joke possessed a particularly sharp wit, but because of its sheer absurdity, and in that moment, absurdity felt infinitely safer than the pervasive grief. That laughter, so foreign to their accustomed expressions, unsettled them as much as it began to liberate them. Could one genuinely laugh with an enemy and still remain steadfastly loyal to the memories of the past? Could one partake in a meal with their captor and still cling tenaciously to their animosity? Each nascent smile subtly weakened the certainty of the answers they had once held so firmly. The dismantling of these barriers was not universally welcomed. Some soldiers continued to grumble, viewing compassion as an unfortunate display of weakness. A select few women subtly clenched their fists beneath the tables, determined not to be emotionally swayed or softened. The initial ruptures, once formed, invariably widened. Even those who had staunchly resisted found their hunger gnawing more persistently than their pride. And hunger, when met with unexpected kindness, possessed an extraordinary power to reshape narratives. By the third week following the Thanksgiving feast, the women no longer recoiled when an American soldier approached bearing sustenance. The whispers of poison had ceased. They simply partook, and in doing so, they tentatively embraced a new potential reality, that the adversary might not be the monstrous figure they had been led to believe. What truly struck them most profoundly was not the provision of food itself, but the dawning recognition of shared humanity. The soldiers, in their native tongue, would belt out boisterous, albeit coarse, songs. They'd chuckle over correspondence from their families back home and grumble about their commanding officers. These were not savage brutes, but ordinary men. Some clutched faded photographs of wives or sweethearts. Others, with nimble fingers, carved rudimentary toys from discarded wood for children they'd likely never meet. The women observed, deeply perplexed. The official narratives had depicted them as subhuman creatures, yet here they were, young, flawed, undeniably human. Each observation landed like a heavy blow against the edifice of deceit, its foundations crumbling until debris lay scattered at their feet. Nevertheless, the dismantling of these ingrained barriers did not immediately usher in tranquility. With every mouthful of American rations, a sharp pang of betrayal coursed through the women. This was not a betrayal of their nation, but of the deeply ingrained beliefs that had been imposed upon them. One woman, her voice barely a whisper, voiced the unsettling query, "If they deceived us on this, what else have they hidden?" The question became an unwelcome companion, haunting their nights, stirring restlessly in the darkness like a disquieted spirit. The solid ground of their former convictions had vanished, leaving a void where nothing new had yet taken root. They drifted in a state of profound uncertainty, suspended precariously between old allegiances and emerging truths. A corporal, later discovered in historical records, made a poignant entry in his private journal. They wept as they ate. It was the most peculiar spectacle. I suspect the war ended for them at that humble table, perhaps for me as well. His words conveyed a profound truth that no mere statistic could ever capture. While battles might conclude with formal treaties, wars truly cease within the human heart, often in quiet, unheralded moments. Within the confines of that barracks, on those frigid evenings, the conflict was ebbing not through pronouncements, but through the simple act of sharing a meal. As the month of December progressed, the snow deepened, blanketing the landscape. The gnawing hunger beyond the camp's perimeter intensified, with queues at relief distribution points stretching for blocks. Inside, however, the women continued to receive sustenance, enough to sustain their lives. Each passing day widened the chasm between their deeply held convictions and their lived experiences. By Christmas, the fortifications of propaganda had not merely fractured, they had utterly collapsed, leaving behind questions too weighty to dismiss. And yet, from beneath the detritus of shattered certainties, something delicate began to emerge. It was not yet forgiveness, but a nascent recognition of a shared existence. This realization was inherently perilous, as it compelled the women to confront not only their captors, but, more critically, themselves. The self-discovery was, for many, a terrifying prospect. On the eve of Christmas Eve, as the women lay in hushed silence, one finally broke the profound stillness. "If they are capable of showing compassion," she murmured, her voice a fragile thread, "then what does that make us?" Her words hung in the darkness, an unanswered plea. For the first time, the judgment extended beyond the perceived enemy. The celebratory flames of Thanksgiving had long since extinguished, yet their lingering smoke curled in memory, like invisible tendrils weaving through the subsequent weeks. The snow lay thick across the Rhineland, muffling the devastated landscape in an eerie silence, while the camp remained an isolated pocket of uneasy order. The hunger that afflicted those outside the wire bit with renewed ferocity. But within the confines of the compound, the women were provided with just enough to prevent the encroaching despair from consuming them entirely. Each meal now carried not only physical nourishment, but an unspoken inquiry. What would this unexpected kindness ultimately lead to? The war had concluded, but the verdict of peace remained indeterminate. By December, the initial shock of receiving nourishment had mellowed into a somber routine. The women no longer stiffened with suspicion when trays of food were presented. Instead, they joined the queues with a weary resignation. Yet, every mouthful retained its significance, a constant reminder that their very survival hinged on the actions of those they had been conditioned to abhor. It was not a feeling of gratitude that initially filled them, at least not at first, but a dull ache, a peculiar confluence of relief and profound humiliation. They were alive, yes, but only through the clemency extended by men they had once labeled as enemies. This paradox cut more deeply than any physical deprivation they had endured. Among the occupying soldiers, sentiment was divided. Some chafed at the perceived burden, viewing the women's tears as theatrical or undeserved. Others found themselves profoundly unsettled by the way grief and thankfulness blurred together on those gaunt faces. A lieutenant penned a letter to his wife that December, confessing, "It is far simpler to engage them when they appear as mere phantoms on the battlefield. It becomes considerably more challenging when they are seated across a table, weeping into their food." His correspondence perfectly encapsulated the internal conflict that both sides were grappling with, the erosion of the divide between conqueror and vanquished. Despite this pervasive unease, a fragile sense of connection began to take root. Small acts of generosity started to proliferate. One soldier shared a tin of coffee, another a pair of much-needed socks. One even undertook the task of teaching a woman a few clumsy English phrases, which she, in turn, repeated with a shy, almost startling burst of laughter. These gestures, while unpretentious, began to carve out channels where future reconciliation might, perhaps, flow. It was within the mundane that the extraordinary started to manifest. Yet, achieving reconciliation was not a simple matter of handing over bread and butter. It demanded a significant surrender of pride. One woman, who had once stood at impassioned rallies, her voice ringing with fervent slogans, now found herself clutching a cup of American cocoa, as if it were her only anchor. As she sipped, tears welled unbidden. Within that comforting warmth, she experienced not only solace but a searing realization of the deception she had endured, the extent to which she had been manipulated, and how her unwavering loyalty had been grotesquely distorted. The cocoa tasted bitter with this newfound understanding, yet she consumed it completely. Such moments of dawning awareness spread like an unstoppable whisper. The officers, though pragmatic in their outlook, understood the profound symbolism at play. They recognized that the provision of food was as much a political tool as it was a source of sustenance. A well-nourished captive could potentially become an ally. A starving one would invariably remain an adversary. President Truman himself had alluded to mercy as a calculated strategy, asserting that America's true strength lay not solely in its military might, but in its capacity for generosity. Consequently, these seemingly simple dinners evolved into silent, instructive lessons. Reconciliation, even when initiated under duress, commenced at the communal table. The stark statistics offered undeniable proof. By the conclusion of winter, millions of Germans owed their lives to Allied shipments of grain, powdered milk, and meat, which effectively averted widespread famine. However, these numbers failed to convey the tremor in a woman's hands as she accepted an apple from a GI, or the way she turned it over and over as if cradling a precious jewel. They could not quantify the subtle softening in soldiers' expressions upon hearing laughter, a sound that had once been absent from their interactions. These were not cold figures or official reports. They represented the painstaking gradual mending of the human fabric, one delicate thread at a time. Some individuals actively resisted this process of repair. Shame lingered stubbornly. A few women consumed the food but refused to meet anyone's gaze, muttering that mere survival was a far cry from genuine friendship. After all, pride often represented the final bastion for those who had lost nearly everything. But even pride could not entirely blind the senses. The rich aroma of butter melting on bread spoke more compellingly than any discredited slogans. The warmth in one's stomach proved a more enduring sensation than the chilling pronouncements of propaganda that had long since crumbled. The physical body understood what the mind struggled to accept. Acts of kindness were demonstrably more difficult to forget than acts of cruelty. By Christmas Eve, an unusual quiet pervaded the camp. Snow drifted against the barracks, effectively muffling even the sound of the guards' footsteps. That evening, one soldier produced a harmonica, and another hummed a carol in English. To his surprise, a woman seated across the room joined in softly, her voice blending with the melody in German. The music served as a bridge, transcending linguistic barriers where words had failed. Others soon followed, their voices tentative at first, then growing in strength until the barracks resonated with a hymn that now belonged to both sides. Tears welled once more, not from hunger this time, but from the profound and unexpected communion of sound. For a fleeting moment, the war seemed to recede entirely. In its place stood something raw and vulnerable, a profound recognition that enemies could share songs, the changing seasons, and the universal experience of sorrow. The following morning, bread was laid out, accompanied by small dollops of butter meticulously shaped by hand. It was hardly a celebratory feast, but the gesture itself was profoundly significant. The women ate with a deliberate slowness, as if attempting to prolong this fragile peace. Some offered faint, uncertain, but genuine smiles to the soldiers. This Christmas, the first observed after the unconditional surrender, was not defined by an abundance of material possessions, but by the quiet, miraculous endurance of life, and the nascent stirrings of trust, painstakingly carved from the ruins of conflict. Yet, this process of reconciliation was not without its shadows. For every tear of relief shed, another of profound grief fell. The women could not forget husbands lost in the fields of battle, children who perished in aerial bombardments, or cities reduced to rubble. These memories remained indelible, just as the soldiers could not erase the images of comrades buried on foreign soil. What emerged was not outright forgiveness, not yet, but an uneasy coexistence of remembrance and compassion. Weeping over the fate of Turkey did not erase the devastation of Dresden. Serving cocoa did not bring back the fallen, but it marked the initial, tentative step toward a world where both adversaries might begin to see each other not as enemies, but as fellow human beings. In the years that followed, some of the women would recount that first Thanksgiving meal as the precise moment the war truly ended for them. One woman testified during an oral history project, her voice still faltering even decades later, stating, "I believed every word they told us, that the Americans would treat us like animals. And then, that evening, I ate turkey and wept. I cried because I realized I had been deceived my entire life." Her testimony encapsulated the profound transformation more effectively than any statistical data. Reconciliation had begun, not with grand speeches or formal treaties, but with the simple taste of food offered without expectation or demand. Nevertheless, a persistent question lingered unresolved at the periphery of every shared meal. If compassion could be found within the ranks of the enemy, then what did that imply about all the hatred, the bloodshed, and the sacrifices that had been made? The women carried this heavy burden, much as the soldiers carried theirs, and within that shared weight lay the central dilemma. Could reconciliation truly take root in soil so saturated with sorrow, or would the fragile seeds sown in turkey and tears ultimately wither under the relentless frost of memory? As the year transitioned, the lingering snow gave way to the first signs of the spring thaw. Mud replaced the icy terrain, and with it came the slow, tentative stirring of hope. Though still technically prisoners, the women felt themselves less defined by their confinement and more by the fragile thread of survival that they now shared with their guards. Yet, beneath this surface calm, the fundamental question grew more insistent with each passing day. If simple kindness had been sufficient to dismantle deeply ingrained falsehoods, what other revelations might an act of mercy unveil about the world they thought they understood?